Acts chapter 26 and verse 28. Going to look tonight at the value of a moment, the value of a moment. I'm going to relate to you a story that we've heard too many times in our society, and we'll change some of the names and characters to protect the guilty. But the story goes that John sat in his car after church on a Sunday morning in the driveway of his home with his head slumped into his hands. And the question on his mind was, how in the world did I get here? Once a titan of industry, a popular leader in his company, he was known to be a good father. He was known on the national stage for the work that he had done with charity. He was even a leader in a local church. But his world had come crashing down on that Sunday. Now he found himself sitting in the driveway of his family, homeless, destitute, penniless, and divorced as his company fell apart. And he was wondering to himself, how in the world did these things happen? The modern trend was at play in his life, and that was that he had made a simple decision to know a woman who was not his wife, and it had wreaked havoc in his world. What could possess a man like John, who had the world in the palm of his hands? A man who was a good man, a man who was a leader in his church, and even at one point in his life walked closely with the Lord. What could possess a man to make such a decision? All he could think about in that moment as he sat there in his driveway was a single moment 16 months before where he thought no one would ever find out about. When he imagined himself, he entertained a single thought that he could pleasure himself without anybody ever knowing. But the truth was that nothing ever remains in the darkness. All things come to light. In that story, you see the power of a single moment. A moment where a life was thrown away. A moment that was missed. It's kind of a cliche story, even though I assure you it's real tonight. And yet it drives home a point that I want to make with us tonight. And I thought about how powerful this point is when you consider on a Sunday night, we don't normally have our largest crowds. It's normally a smaller group. And there might be a tendency even to come in and think, hey, this is a secondary service. It's not as important as maybe what we do on a Sunday morning or on a Wednesday night. But I assure you, nothing could be further from the truth. I'm amazed how many times in life God gives us a single moment that sometimes we pass the test and we value that moment and we see how important it was. We redeem that time, and then other times I fail and I miss it. I miss what he was trying to teach. Tonight, I think is one moment in your life, perhaps amongst millions or thousands. And yet I would say, let's not miss this moment as we look in Acts chapter 26. In Acts chapter 26, I'm sure most of you, if you've been in church for very long, you are familiar with this encounter. It's an encounter between the Apostle Paul and a king by the name of Agrippa. He was a man, King Agrippa was, who held the world seemingly in the palm of his hands. And yet, he's about to miss a moment. He's about not to redeem a time, an opportunity. He's going to miss something that was directly placed in front of him that I hope we don't miss tonight. He couldn't redeem that time, that moment, because he was distracted by other things that were around him. He was distracted by other things and other people that were demanding his attention. Acts chapter 26 and verse 28, we have his response again. And Agrippa said to Paul, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? The story is not hard to understand, and I'll relate it to the best of my ability tonight while trying to be timely. We find Paul as a prisoner of Rome for the past couple of years, according to Acts chapter 24. And time again during his imprisonment, he would be brought before a local governor for amusement and for challenge. They wanted to make a spectacle of this titan of the Christian faith, the titan of this newfound faith in the world. It was clear that over and over again, their intent was never to listen to the apostles' pleas for their response to the gospel of Jesus Christ, but rather it was always about an opportunity to show themselves. It was an opportunity to make fun, to have amusement, and just to relish and to glory in their own selves. When we come to Acts chapter 26, Paul is now standing before the Roman ruler Festus and also this man whom you know as King Agrippa, the leader, the ruler of the Jews. His imprisonment, Paul's, had given him an opportunity over and over again to both of these men to proclaim the gospel. And to proclaim the gospel he had faithfully over the years. He tells his own story here in Acts chapter 26 of his own personal conversion. From one who persecuted the church to one who now boldly proclaims the message of Christ. And we hear it again in Philippians in chapters 1 and chapter 2, and especially in chapter 3. He tells Agrippa that he has been given a unique message of telling the Jews and the Gentiles of the forgiveness of sin that is found in Jesus Christ, that they might be brought from darkness unto light, delivered, he says in verse 18, from the power of Satan to the power of God. He tells them in verses 22 and 23 that the message he was delivering to them was what God had promised through the prophets and Moses from long, long ago. In other words, Paul was presenting the case that Jesus was the fulfillment of the world's history. He was the fulfillment of everything God had been promising to do from generation to generation. That Christ was the long-awaited Messiah who would come and would suffer according to the prophet Isaiah and the verses we read this morning in chapter 53. He laid before the people the sacrificial death of Christ in his message here in chapter 26. Perhaps it was much like the sermon that reflected the words of Romans chapter 3 and verses 24 and 25, where he described that God delivered Christ as a propitiation, a sin offering, to remove us from under the condemnation of God's wrath. Our sin, it had created a barrier between us and God. We deserve his wrath tonight. But because of the work of Christ, we don't get that wrath. We had offended God. We had offended his very nature. And there indeed is nothing that we could ever do, Paul says in Romans 3, to ever earn God's favor expressed toward us in this life. But seeing that there was nothing that we could do, the Father put forward Christ for our iniquity. Isaiah the prophet writes of him that he would be bruised for our iniquities. He would be crushed for our transgressions. And by his stripes, what glorious words, by his stripes we are healed. But Paul says that indeed this was not the end. Instead, he would tell them in chapter 26 that Jesus, having been buried in a cold, dark tomb, that he would be raised from the dead, roll back the door of the tomb, and thunder forth in glorious praise of God the Father. And in that thunderous victory, he declared light to the Jews and to the Gentiles, liberty to the captives, and freedom to the oppressed. That was the message that Paul delivered to Festus and Agrippa in this moment. It was something that Cornerstone Baptist Church is fairly unfamiliar with, and that is a short sermon. There was no long exposition of the gospel, but rather a simple and plain presentation of the substitutionary death and victorious resurrection of Jesus Christ on behalf of the people. And when he got to the end of that sermon, he turned to Agrippa and offered an invitation in verse 27, and he said, "King Agrippa, do you believe?" When you heard that message proclaimed, when you heard what was said, when you heard about what had happened to Christ, do you believe this? It's a simple question, isn't it, when you think about it? Do you accept the things that have been spoken? That's his invitation. He declares that there was nothing irrational about this proclamation, unlike what the world might say today. There was nothing deceitful. There was nothing secretive. After all, everything he proclaimed was known to all. Even surely he thought the king would have heard of these great things. I mean, a man raising from the dead, inspiring in a new faith that would spread across the entire Roman world. Surely the king had heard about these things before. So he says to him in this moment, having all of the facts, King Agrippa, do you believe? Do you respond? Do you accept? In this moment, I want to kind of focus on that thought for a few moments. Agrippa's response was, in a short time, would you persuade me to be a Christian? That's the English Standard Version. Some translations read, you almost persuadest me to be a Christian. The emphasis is on the moment in that time. That Paul was somehow convinced that after a short sermon, he would have convinced the great king of the Jews of the truth of the message of the gospel. He thought to himself, it didn't take a lot. It didn't take a long exposition. It didn't take a broad apologetic approach. It didn't take a lot of explanation. It was a simple message. Surely you have heard of these things. Do you believe? And the king's response was, you think I'm going to make a decision right here, right now, in this moment? He's saying to Paul, you expect me to make a decision, which by your own description is a big one, right now? You expect me to make a decision in front of these people? We're about to find out that there's an entire court in his presence. You expect me to make a decision in this moment with all of this going around? We brought you in here for amusement. You've given me a sermon and a lecture, and you're wanting to know if I'm going to respond in this instant? There are three things I think that caused Agrippa to miss that moment when he asked that question. The first is found back in chapter 25 and verse 23. And that is that the first thing that caused Agrippa to miss the moment was the pride that he had in his heart. So on the next day, we're told in verse 23, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp. I like that word. It's an interesting word. And they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. It's all one setting. I want you to notice that, first of all, Luke tells us that Agrippa came to this moment with a lot of pomp. He was dressed probably in the most expensive of linens. He was in the most beautiful of jewelry, the crowns of splendor. He rode the accolades of the people as they praised his every moment. In fact, history tells us that Agrippa gave himself a name, and that is that he called himself Great King, Pious Friend of Caesar, and Friend of Rome. In other words, history tells us that Agrippa fancied himself as a powerful man and a friend of Rome and Caesar. He gloated in who he was, we learn. He boasted in it. He had monuments erected in his image so that others could see his greatness. In this moment, Paul was calling Agrippa to take an appraisal of his life. Was he willing to sacrifice his riches, his kingdom, his prestige? Was he willing to follow Christ, even if it meant losing everything? Yet the word that Luke uses to describe this pomp there in Acts chapter 25 and 23 is actually the word roughly translated fantasia. It's the word that we get, are you ready? The word phantom from. It's a fantasy. It's not something that is actual reality. Luke is doing a brilliant, masterful job in this moment as describing the king riding into this moment, into this town, with all of his wealth, all of his status, all of his soldiers, all of his stature, and yet it is nothing more than a mirage. As good as he looks, he's not that great. They were illusions of safety. They were illusions of power. They were illusions of grandeur. They were temporal, you might say. He was rich in this life, but he was totally poor, Luke is saying, in those things which matter the most. I thought about that a lot today, this afternoon, as I was kind of thinking on a few things, and I thought how often that word could be used as descriptive of things in our life. They're nothing more than a fantasia. They seem important at the moment. They seem to provide for us wealth and power. In fact, I was reading an article this week about how the next war isn't going to be fought with nuclear bombs, but rather it's going to be fought through technology and cybersecurity. And the author went on to explain that if you really wanted to disrupt the world, throw it into complete chaos, just think on this for a moment. All you would have to do is hack into banking systems, kill power grids, because none of us carry cash anymore, for example. Banks would close their doors. They wouldn't let you come in and withdraw until they were able to get back online and be able to understand what was going on. I got up this morning under the illusion that I was safe, under the illusion that I was secure, under the illusion that I had what I needed for the day. And yet I could find out in just a slippery moment how bad things might really be. See, this is where the problem comes in for Agrippa. Agrippa didn't know that this was all an illusion. You ever notice how you tell yourself something long enough, you eventually begin to believe it? You convince yourself of something that isn't true, and you know it's not true. You know it's not true from the beginning, but you tell yourself it long enough that you begin to believe it. That was Agrippa. He had surrounded himself with wealth. He had surrounded himself with prestige and power and pomp. And they only pushed him further away from realizing his real poverty, the poverty of the soul. They were mirages of water in a dry and barren desert. They distracted him from his reality, his poverty before God. I want you to know tonight that problem is not unique to Agrippa, as you already know. You may have all of the finest linens, the most precious jewelry, or even the best of the best. Yet we spend our time seeking after these things, temporal matters, mirages of water in a dry and barren land that cannot quench our thirst, that cannot make us rich in eternity, that cannot feed our soul or feed our spirit. They are merely fantasias of the mind and the heart. Beautiful tombs covering up the deadness inside of us. And yet, what we do is we pursue them. Like Agrippa, we find them more important. Important enough to shun the question, do you believe this? The second thing that made Agrippa miss this moment was not only did he have a pride problem, but Agrippa had a people problem. In chapter 26 and verse 24, we learn that one of the people that I've already told you about that was with Agrippa in this moment was Festus. He had responded to Paul's message with a proclamation of his own. He says to Paul, Paul, you are a madman. You are out of your mind. When Paul preached the gospel, Festus didn't mix any words. He said, this guy has lost his mind. This would have made him a great member at Cornerstone Baptist Church. You know what I mean? He says, this guy has totally lost it. You think that when Festus made that proclamation, that wasn't peer pressure on Agrippa? Absolutely. Remember what I told you Agrippa had given himself the name as? He had given himself the name as the friend of Caesar, the friend of Rome. He had set himself up as this powerful man. And here was the leader of Rome saying, this guy, he's crazy. His cheese has slipped off of his cracker, right? And Agrippa, what's Agrippa supposed to do in that moment? Is he supposed to say, no, you're wrong. You're wrong about him. He isn't crazy. He's right. Remember, Agrippa considers himself this great friend of Rome and Caesar. He named his capital after the Emperor Nero. And here he sat next to a Roman ruler who was saying, this guy has lost his mind. His message you shouldn't believe. What is Agrippa supposed to say to that? Well, is he supposed to disagree with a Roman ruler? What if he did? Well, that could have even meant a death sentence for him. Perhaps it might have meant the end of his kingship. Festus might have told the rest of Rome that Agrippa had somehow gotten as a part of these Christians and he wasn't to be trusted anymore. And maybe he would have been removed from his seat of power. Who knows what would have happened to him if he had confessed belief, but he had a people problem. He had somebody there that was saying, don't believe these words. Back in chapter 25 and verse 23, remember that when Agrippa came with pomp, he entered into the assembly hall. That means that as he was there, he was gathering with his military tribunes, his prominent men, as it were, of the nation. Not only does Agrippa in this moment have a people problem with the Roman ruler, not only is he worried about what Rome thinks about this decision, this message, but now he has to worry about what the cool people think. He has to worry about what the mighty men of his military think. Paul is being brash. Paul, if you had discussed this, you can hear Agrippa saying this, Paul, if you had discussed this in private with me some more, maybe I could make a decision then, but when everybody's out here watching, you want me to make a decision in front of them, and I'm not ready to do that. This business of calling me out in front of all of these people, you've gone too far. Don't try to make me make a decision right now. Let's discuss this in private. But perhaps it was not Festus that was Agrippa's greatest people problem. Maybe it wasn't even the mighty men. Perhaps his greatest problem, people problem, was his woman problem. Chapter 25 and verse 23. And all the men said, we knew it would come back to the ladies. Who was she? Well, it says in chapter 25, verse 23, that he was in this moment with a woman by the name of Bernice. Bernice was the queen by an incestuous relationship. She was an immoral woman, and she was willing to be married to whoever would grant her the most power, we learn. She was first married to Agrippa's uncle, and then she was married to Agrippa. After Agrippa, she would later be married to Titus, who would be the son of Vespasian. In other words, she was a perverted idol worshiper, but more importantly, she was in the inner circle of Agrippa, trying to always claim more and more power, even if it meant being in an incestuous relationship. Perhaps he could have been convinced if it was just Festus sitting there. Perhaps he could have been convinced if he could have mustered up the courage if it had just been the mighty men who were sitting there. But as he sat there in the presence of a wicked queen, he could not muster the ability to answer the Apostle Paul in the affirmative. If he confessed belief, what was that going to say about his relationship and his lifestyle with Queen Bernice? She would be totally unaccepting of these changes. She would have had to move on. This would have been all new moral changes for Agrippa, and she would not have been on board with all of that. But I want you to listen to this. Paul's question to Agrippa was not, does Bernice believe? It was not, does Festus believe? It was not, do the mighty men believe? Paul's question to Agrippa was, do you believe? Do you believe? He did not ask Agrippa to tell him what all the other rest of the world was thinking. He was saying, Agrippa, what do you think about these things? Agrippa had a pride problem, fantasia. He built himself up into an illusion. He had a people problem, had too many people around him that he couldn't sacrifice in front of. But now his greatest problem was his perception problem. You remember that in our passage, Agrippa's question to Paul was, you expect me to be persuaded in such a short time? Agrippa's problem is our time tonight, and that is the reason redeeming the time. Agrippa was saying, this is going to require me to redeem this moment. The reason redeeming the time is so difficult is because you and I, we think that we have an innumerable amount of minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and even years. And so when we're faced, as Agrippa was, with life-altering decisions, we think, I'll make that decision tomorrow. We're convinced that we can walk away from this place tonight. Somebody's going to hear these words and say, I can go away tonight. I'll go back home and I'll think about these things. I'll give them some consideration. We think we can go back to our homes. We can go spend a fun weekend away from home. We can live our lives as usual, repeat the process continually, and then maybe someday we'll redeem the moment. 65, 70, 80 years of life, there's always time to make a decision for Christ. There's always a time to make a decision to go into missions. There's always a time to make a decision to answer the call into ministry. There's always time to make these important, life-changing decisions. Let's just put them off a little while. There's always time to get more serious about my relationship with Christ, right? We're invincible, we think. We're destined for long lives. After all, God owes us, doesn't He, some freedom to have some fun? I mean, we work hard for our kids and our families. We sacrifice. God wouldn't certainly be objecting to us not redeeming just a few moments. Students or adults, whoever is in the sound of my voice, listen, if you hear nothing of what I say tonight, I want you to hear this one thing. You will never redeem the time till you find the value in a moment. You'll never redeem the time God's given to you until you see the value of a single moment. Listen to what Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13 says. But exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. What a powerful verse. Exhort one another every day, he says, as long as it is called today. Don't wait till tomorrow. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 15. As it is said today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts into rebellion. Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 21, Jesus told a parable. The parable went something like this. The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And he says, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Can't you just hear it now? Soul, Chris, Just settle down a little bit. Don't be so passionate about this church thing. Don't be so passionate about the gospel. Don't be so passionate about missions. Don't be passionate about it today. There's ample time to redeem those things. There's ample time to deal with them. But God said to him in the parable, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. The scriptural testimony over and over again, beloved, tonight is that neither you nor I, none of us, is guaranteed to finish even this message tonight. And so the admonishment is, let's value this moment. Be ready. Agrippa did not value the moment because he perceived it to be too short. He said to Paul, Paul, I might use a little more time to think on these things. If you give me just a few more moments, I could maybe come to the decision you want, but I can't make that decision right now. He imagined that he had all the time in the world to make a decision. He may give Paul an opportunity to speak many more times. I mean, after all, they were bringing him out to amuse them. He wasn't all that old. He had lots of time to make up his mind in this moment about these matters. Because he did not value this moment, when Paul said those words, he missed it. Tonight, I think that there are some, even in a congregation this small, there are some who have a pride problem. I'll just be honest with you. One of my professors in school, he would always say, the interesting thing about humility is the moment you realize you've achieved it, you've lost it. I have seen in my own life over and over again how one has to be intentional about fighting pride, right? You even do great things for the Lord. God blesses you and God overwhelms you and does far above and beyond exceedingly what you could have ever imagined. And yet there's little moments where you start to well up with a little bit of pride and you say, yeah, man, I did that. I was a part of that. There's some in this room that suffer from the same fantasia that Agrippa suffered from, an illusion of reality. Maybe you're not prideful in the sense that you walk around always bragging on yourself. I mean, if you do that, you probably don't have very many friends. That's why we'll put you on one side of the room, right? But you have pride in this sense. You think to yourself, I've got plenty of money in my retirement account. I've got plenty of money in my savings account. I've got a nice house. I've got a nice car. I've built up for myself a life that people can look at and respect. Beloved, all of those things, not bad in themselves, but all of those things are built upon a cultural concept that is a lie. A cultural cup of water that is offered to us in a dry and barren land that does not satisfy us, because when we drink of it, we find out it was not water at all, but sand. Our souls, they were made for more. Our souls long for, like a runner running in a marathon, for something more. Our souls long for, like a withering plant in the hot summer sun. We want something more. And yet, oftentimes, we settle for the fantasia. That's pride. We settle for what the world has to offer. We kind of fall in love. I think of that parable of the sower from a few weeks ago. We fall in love with the things of the world, and they start to choke out the life. Paul was saying in this moment, I've got something better for you, Agrippa. And tonight, I offer you something better. I offer you something that the soul has longed for its entire existence. I offer to you something tonight that the culture cannot solve, the culture cannot offer to you, and that is Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Tonight, we have a providential moment in front of us. We are confronted, as it were, with two roads. Tonight we are confronted with one road that leads to a path of destruction, leaving the soul dry and barren, and another road which is one of surrender, a surrender that the world, that all of the world will not recognize, and a surrender that says that what the world has offered is not really reality, and a surrender that says, man, if I give up all of this, I get the greatest, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. That when our time is past, we can leap out of our poverty from here and leap into eternal riches for the ages. We offer that tonight in Jesus Christ. But it's not just about believing in him. It's not just about believing in him tonight. There's a pride problem in churches, and in our church, we struggle with this. There's a pride problem where we think of ourselves, well, we've got a certain amount of people, we're safe. We've got a certain amount of a budget, we're safe. We've got a certain amount of our leadership, we're safe. Beloved, it's all a fantasia. It's all a fantasia. Because what God wants us to do is to invest in eternity. We have a people problem sometimes. We get surrounded by Felixes, those who view the message of the gospel. They're powerful in our lives. They have some sort of power over it, and we fear their reproach. Maybe that's not you, but even me, if I'm to be honest, there are certain people in life that I just assumed they liked me, right? I would just assume that they didn't reproach me. We have the prominent crowd in our lives that we fear their ostracism. We have the Bernices in our life. Those people in our inner circle whose perversion will be affected by our decisions and subsequent transformations. We have those people in our lives, in short, that if we fully commit ourselves to Christ, to his work, to eternal kingdom building, if we do that, they're going to look at us and say, you are crazy. You have lost your mind. And so because of them, we miss this moment. And sometimes we have a perception problem. We think we have all the time in the world, and maybe by God's grace you'll have more moments than the one you have tonight. But I would ask you, is it worth a chance? You are not concerned. You're 20, 30, 40, 50. After all, I've got lots of time. I'm probably concerned for you most of all if that would be your mindset tonight, because I want you to understand that none of us is promised tomorrow. James 4:13-14 says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life, James writes? For you are, listen to this, you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Anybody wake up, some of you who are older tonight, anybody wake up one day and go, man, where did all that time go? Where did it all go? It sure seemed like I was supposed to have more. It seemed like that just went by way too fast. My admonition to you would be appraise this moment tonight, this service. You don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. You don't even really know what 5 minutes from now is going to bring. So let me close with a thought, final thought tonight. Agrippa had basically two choices in this moment. He could say to Paul, yes, I believe, and by doing so, he would have changed everything. Or he could say to Paul, I don't believe, and by doing so, he might have angered the pious Jews who were there that thought that maybe he was saying he didn't believe the prophets and Moses. So there he was. There Agrippa was in this moment. He was stuck in between a rock and a hard place. Or to put it more succinctly, as Robert Duvall says it in the movie Open Range, Agrippa was stuck between the eternities. He was stuck. He didn't want to make either decision. So what Agrippa did was almost worse than saying no. That is that he said nothing. He said nothing. He simply ignored the message and he left, halted between two positions. Beloved, I want you to know that tonight, Agrippa, for all of eternity, I sense will remember this moment in Acts chapter 26. For all of eternity, Agrippa is in hell thinking about what he should have said in that moment. He's thinking about what I should have said. That he didn't cast aside those things which were separating him from his decision. That he simply rode the fence. He's thinking for all of eternity, man, what could I have done different? Tonight, I want us to value this moment by not letting it pass by. I don't want us to be like Agrippa. I was talking to one of my pastor friends fairly recently, and we were talking about what's happened, how God has moved here at Cornerstone Baptist Church. And it's been a couple of months ago now. We were talking about how God had moved, and I was expressing how thankful I was seeing so many new faces and just talking about how good God was. And he was telling me about some of the struggles in his church. And he made a comment, and he didn't mean it in the wrong way, but he said, man, I look forward to a day when I can be like you, when I can be at a church and be settled in and be comfortable and know that the bills are going to get paid and that everything's taken care of and that the church is on solid ground. Listen, he meant it in the most positive of ways. But I said to him, I said, brother, I said, that thought, what you just said, makes me want to vomit. I don't want to pastor a church that isn't a little bit dangerous. I don't want to pastor a church that's just settled in. I don't want to pastor a church that's just living on firm foundations, so to speak. I don't want to pastor a church where we're just thinking we have it all together. I want to press forward, even if it means making a few mistakes along the way. Even if it means making difficult decisions. I want to press forward because, listen, all of that stuff, when I get to heaven, Jesus is not going to ask me how many people Cornerstone Baptist Church Sanctuary could see. It's not important. All of those things, even good in church life, they're fantasias. They're illusions. When what matters is what has been done in the name of Christ for the kingdom. Tonight, you think this message is about salvation, and it is. Certainly it was for Agrippa. Agrippa was asked whether or not he wanted to spend eternity with Jesus or spend eternity somewhere else. And Agrippa said, I don't want to make that decision right now. He said, I'm not ready. I'm not prepared to do that. But I want you to understand that there are all kinds of these moments in our lives that aren't just about trusting in Jesus. They're about, has God called me to go into missions? Has God called me to serve on a team? Has God called me to do something different in my home, in my family? Has God told me to sell some of my things and give it to the church so that the gospel can go across to the globe? There's all kinds of these moments. And our natural temptation is to say, I've got lots of time. I don't have to do that today. Beloved, don't do that. You'll never redeem the time until you value the moment. What is God saying to you tonight? What is the question that God would ask you tonight? Maybe you got to give something up. Maybe you got to give some people up. Maybe you got to put some pride away. Maybe you got to get some things out of your life. What is it that God would be asking you tonight? And here's my commendation. Value this moment. Don't walk away from here and let it go. Respond. Stand with me reverently and let's pray.